Strangely enough, in the last couple of days, we've seen multiple NHL superstars put their future in doubt, with Kirill Kaprizov, Sidney Crosby, and even Quinn Hughes having a ton of new trade rumors surrounding them. And it really feels like hockey season is getting closer and closer because it seems like the trade rumor mill has officially woken up. But let's start out today with the Kirill Kaprizov situation. This one is fascinating to me as one of the top free agents in 2026. It seems like Kaprizov's willingness to stay in Minnesota seems to be dwindling. Or at least on a long-term deal, because you see this tweet from Frank Seravalli saying that the sources say Minnesota's superstar Kirill Kaprizov's camp turned down an extension offer believed to be 8 years, $128 million. And they go on to say that would make him the highest paid player in NHL history in both AAV, $16 million, and total dollars. And I gotta say, this is absolutely, I guess for lack of a better term, wild. And we've heard a lot about Kaprizov's contract negotiations from Minnesota, how patient Kaprizov wants to keep it, but rejecting a $16 million deal is shocking to me. Now, this has been mentioned a few times since this tweet was made, but I do believe it that Kaprizov's willingness, it seems like, to want to keep himself in Minnesota on a long-term contract seems to be rather low, especially when you consider, again, $16 million per year. That's about as good as you could really hope for. I don't think there's many opportunities that Kaprizov's going to have to make more than $16 million. Even on the open market, I don't really see him getting much more than that. So I think this largely comes down to a term situation for Kaprizov, and that seems to kind of be his problem, especially as Minnesota tries to negotiate with him. The thing is, though, this isn't really new when it comes to Kaprizov in Minnesota. Back when he entered the NHL, he only signed a 2-year contract to go from the KHL onto the Wild back in 2020. Then after that, he signed a 5-year contract, which isn't horrible, but also not the long-term contract that he could have signed with Minnesota, and now we're seeing him into free agency potentially in 2026. We could obviously get into the trade rumor speculation here, but I think at the very least what this tells us is that Kaprizov's willingness to sign long-term in Minnesota just isn't there. The appetite just isn't there from him, and that is pretty rough for a Minnesota team that really has been building their entire team around this player. And it's easy to see why. He's one of the best wings, one of the best offensive players in the NHL when he is healthy, even though that has kind of been a bit of a hit or miss over the last few seasons. When he is on top of his game, he's among the best out there. Still a few years removed from an 108-point season, a 96-point season back in 2024. When he is on his game, he's one of the best goal scorers, one of the best players in the NHL. So to see him get offered upwards of $16 million, especially on a long-term deal, especially with the cap going up as much as it's projected, that's not really much of a surprise. But to see Kaprizov reject the offer outright, I think is pretty shocking. And if Kaprizov were to have signed that contract day one, he would have instantly became the highest cap hit player in the NHL, would have been the most lucrative contract in NHL history, and would have immediately put him at the top. So to reject that type of offer, that type of money, takes some guts. And it's also been talked about fairly recently in the Connor McDavid negotiations, how he might want to take a shorter term deal to kind of put some more pressure on Edmonton to build around him perfectly. Well, I could see Kaprizov doing the exact same thing and even having a much better chance than McDavid, I would say, to actually hit free agency. I remember a lot of different rumors last year back in 2024 about him wanting to go to the Chicago Blackhawks, for example. We'll see if there's actually any truth to that at all, but I think him testing free agency at this point seems a lot more likely. I will say this, though. Kaprizov, I think, does have the opportunity to make more than that if he does have a healthy, complete, successful season this next year. And let's say he does go to the open market, signs with a different team, he'd probably be the biggest free agent signing since, what, like Artemi Panarin? But if Kaprizov were to leave Minnesota, that team would be ruined. I mean, they have a really good prospect pool, some really interesting names already coming up, like Brock Faber, of course, who's already established himself. I love me still some Marco Rossi. ZBUM's going to be huge for them. But even with all that considered, Kaprizov leaving this team would be a disastrous situation. Finally, Minnesota, after all these years, was able to find their superstar just for him to leave just a few years later. It would be the worst case scenario. Even though Minnesota might be in a situation where they have to take a shorter term contract, at the end of the day, you do that if it means keeping him, because there's no way that you can't. Though I will say this, if Minnesota is in a situation where they aren't even finding success trying to negotiate a shorter term contract, I could see a situation where a Kaprizov trade ends up opening up around the deadline if they continue to have just a stalemate in terms of negotiations. Minnesota cannot afford to let him walk into free agency for nothing, and that could really spark some interesting conversations in that front office. That's for sure. I say interesting, but apocalyptic conversations, I think, is the better way to put it. Now we move on to the Sidney Crosby rumors, I guess you could call it, surrounding him and his future with the Pittsburgh Penguins. And it's interesting because over the last couple of years, we've heard Crosby's name sprinkled around there. Some people wanting to get engagement, talking about him going to Colorado, Montreal, places like that, but it being really constantly denied time after time. But strangely, over the last week, we heard not just Sidney Crosby, but also his agent talk about the situation, his future in Pittsburgh, and kind of stroke the fire a bit. Now, first we had Crosby's agent come out and talk about the possibility of Crosby leaving Pittsburgh, and he said it's always a possibility, you know? It's been 3 years, and Pittsburgh hasn't made the playoffs. It all depends on how Sid is going to be and how the team is going to do. I believe that Sid should be playing playoff hockey every year. And then Crosby was asked about the Montreal Canadiens in an interview with the Athletic's Pierre LeBrun, saying, "I get it, trust me. Growing up a Montreal fan and being from not too far from there, I understand how passionate they are. I get it, why that would come up and that sort of thing, the speculation. It doesn't make it any easier when you're losing to hear those things, but at the same time, to know that a team like that wants you is not the end of the world. It could be worse," and then he smiled. And this is fascinating to me, guys, because over the past couple of years, we've heard, again, constant denial from all of Pittsburgh media and everything about the potential of Crosby even considering leaving Pittsburgh. But now we've gotten both Sidney Crosby and his agent asked about it in the same span in just a couple of days, and both of their answers were not really denial whatsoever. It's so easy, and it happens constantly for these agents, for these players to say, we're going to wait and see with the season, see what happens. I'm focused on the year, and that's all we needed to say, and that's what they've been saying for a long time. But it's strange now that when Crosby's asked about it, for example, he's like, yeah, it's not the end of the world to be linked to Montreal. What do you mean by that, Sid? Interesting. I'm just saying, when he gets brought up in these conversations, when Pat Brisson was talking about Sidney Crosby, there was no denial. There was no trying to change the subject. They're like, yeah, we don't know what's going to happen with Pittsburgh. We might end up leaving eventually. And that's a serious change in tone from what we've seen before. My official stance on this for the longest time was that I didn't see the Penguins ever trading Sidney Crosby. I thought he was going to do everything possible to stay as a Penguin for life and retire there in Pittsburgh. But over the last week, it feels like things have changed for the better, for the worse in ways, at least when it comes to Crosby's anticipation of Pittsburgh long term. And that's the interesting thing, is that I don't think you really realistically should be expecting this Pittsburgh team to be a contender. And maybe that's starting to set in for Sidney Crosby because, again, it seems like his mentality has kind of shifted a bit. If the number one thing for Sidney Crosby is winning and trying to go after a Stanley Cup, I think Pittsburgh has made it pretty known to him and the rest of that core that they're kind of in a retooling phase. They're going to that next generation of Pittsburgh Penguins, and I think Crosby, in ways, could end up changing his mind eventually, and that's all it takes for him to go to a different team. Everybody else in the NHL would line up dramatically to get Sidney Crosby, not just Montreal, and Pittsburgh would have the options if they wanted to. Of course, the two teams that get talked about the most, Colorado and Nathan MacKinnon, and Montreal, of course, with the connections there. I do think Montreal, though, makes a little bit more sense for, one, what they're able to give up, and especially what Pittsburgh would want, and two, just the fit there. Even though he would be awesome with Nathan MacKinnon, Montreal just needs this type of center more, especially somebody at the level of Crosby, who's still among the best centers in the NHL, would be their best center immediately, even if Nick Suzuki is extremely gifted and talented. He has just been so consistent, so rock steady in Pittsburgh, and the last reason why they've been so down to the dumps lately, he has continued to just put up amazing season after amazing season, and that type of influence in Montreal's locker room and that organization would go such a long way. With this Montreal team trying to take steps forward, trying to solidify them as contenders, there's really nobody out there that could do a better job at giving you more respect than a Sidney Crosby, and of course leading by example. That type of influence just all throughout that roster, especially for the younger players. It's not really calculated or really tangible just how much of a difference he would make. So for Montreal, in so many ways, if they had the opportunity, they should be going after it. That's the interesting part, though, is I think what Crosby would cost, because I think that ends up taking Colorado out of the equation because they really don't have many younger pieces that I think would be all that tantalizing for Pittsburgh. Montreal, on the other hand, has all of the younger pieces to possibly offer up in a trade, and that's why I think it would be a lot more likely there. Now, there's been the TSN panels out there saying, what if they offer Demidov 1-for-1? Stop. That's stupid. That's never going to happen. But I could see Montreal offering, like a Michael Hage, a first-round pick, another top prospect perhaps. Not anything on the level of a Lane Hudson or an Ivan Demidov, of course, but this is what Montreal's pool is here to do. You have an opportunity to strike for somebody that is pretty much perfect for what the team needs. I mean, they're looking for a second-line center. If you got Sidney Crosby as your second-line center, you're doing pretty well for yourself. The big reason why I don't think they're going to have a full, unbelievable Demidov-like package, though, for Crosby is just because of the age. If this was even 5 years ago, absolutely, I think that would be more of a conversation. But at 38 years old, even though Sidney Crosby has aged incredibly gracefully, he's not going to be doing that forever. Even though I think he has still a few more years left of golden age Crosby goodness, it's going to dry up eventually. Even though I don't think Montreal should sell the whole farm, I do think it is still going to cost a lot for Pittsburgh to get rid of Crosby. I mean, again, the no-move clause there. There's no real need for Pittsburgh to do it, even if it might be better for them technically long-term. For them to have Crosby stay and retire as a Penguin is pretty priceless, I would imagine, for that organization, unless things change, of course, than they seemingly have over the last week. So, a interesting situation to keep an eye on if Pittsburgh, again, like I assume they will, has another disappointing season, if Crosby's mentality starts to change. But, of course, if they were to line up, Montreal would be a fantastic suitor and easily one of the favorites there, as they probably should be. It's a match made in heaven, both for the stories and for what both teams might need. Now on to the last player to talk about here, and let's go on to Quinn Hughes, somebody that has gotten wrapped up in also a lot of trade rumors, maybe some that maybe aren't quite as deserved, but there's been a lot of talk about the Hughes banding together over the last few seasons, but there's been a lot of questions thrown towards the Canucks management, and specifically towards Hughes, about that recently. Now this drama is spurring a bit from when Jim Rutherford, the Canucks president, pretty much out of nowhere talked about Quinn Hughes and how much he wants to play with his brother. That was a few months ago, and it seems like that conversation has crept up back again. Another player that will be a future UFA, somebody to keep an eye on a ton, as he is, like Kaprizov to the Wild, such an integral piece to that Canucks team. Without Quinn Hughes, they're pretty much nothing. And Greg Wyshynski asked Quinn Hughes about the quote that he wants to play with his brother, saying, I don't know, Jim's a smart guy. Jim's doing, what he wants to do. I've got a lot of respect for Jim, so I'll just leave it at that. And it feels like Quinn's quotes all throughout this have kind of been scooting around the issues here. Because we had Pierre LeBrun talk to Jack Hughes specifically about the future and possibly playing together, and Jack said, this is the headline question, Honestly, I'm not afraid to say it. Yeah, I would love for Quinn to eventually, I'd love to play with him. And whether that's in New Jersey or at what time that takes, at some point, I want to play with Quinn. But yeah, that's the question going around. They talk all day about it up in Vancouver, But yes, I'd love to play with Quinn at some point. And that's the thing, is that I don't really blame Jack for this quote. If I had a brother in the NHL and I was in the NHL too, of course I'd want to play with them. What kind of question is that? So in Jack's case, I don't blame Matt all there. And Quinn kind of had the same realization as I did. Matt Larkin having the quote here. Quinn Hughes responds to his brother Jack's claim he'd love to play with him. I mean, he's my brother. What's he supposed to say? First of all, I don't want to play with him. And yeah, I kind of agree there. And I think in ways we're kind of conflating brothers just wanting to play with each other to them actually ending up signing in the end, because I don't think that's the most realistic possibility. I still think the most realistic possibility is he ends up with the Canucks still long-term, because they're a team that desperately needs him to stay. But if he does go to New Jersey, obviously that would be an incredible story. I just think in ways there's not really anything else they could say, right? I mean, Quinn's not going to come out here and say, oh, I would never want to play with my brother, Jack and Luke. That's, of course he would want to, but that's not the whole story, and that's not everything going into his future extension decision. There's a lot of pieces in play, and if he does end up finding his way in New Jersey, obviously that's something that would be really fun, and I think would be something that Quinn would really like to do. But at the same time, if Vancouver makes more sense, if they're offering more money, if there's a different team that's offering more money, then at the end of the day, you pick what's best for you. And it seems like, at least in Quinn's case, that's also what he's thinking. I will say though, recently when Quinn Hughes has been asked about contract negotiations, his future in Vancouver, he sidestepped it a little bit too much for my liking, maybe raising some red flags here and there. But at the end of the day, we're still a year and a half at least from him being a UFA, and that's something that Vancouver will have to wrestle with, but they have more time than Minnesota and Kaprizov, for example. I will say for New Jersey, I mean, Luke Hughes hasn't signed either, so they got to end up figuring out that situation too. So seems like this is kind of another one that we got to wait and see a little bit, especially for Quinn though, because again, we're still a year and a half out. but another one to keep an eye on because this is easily one of the most talented defensemen out there, an argument for the best defenseman out there in the league, and he's another one that if he goes into free agency, oh man, the numbers flying out there. The opportunities for Quinn are going to be pretty decent to say the least. But that's my breakdown on some of the recent superstars that we've seen kind of have their future put into question recently. Thank you guys so much for tuning in and watching all the way through the end. If you guys enjoyed, hit that like button, hit that subscribe and the notification bell. Comment down below all your thoughts on the Kaprizov rumors, Crosby, Quinn Hughes. Let me know where you think they end up staying or going. And just a big thank you to everyone who watched today. I'm extremely sick still, but my sore throat has cleared up just a little bit, so I'm trying my best, but I appreciate you guys for watching here today, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Hopefully I'm a little more healthy for that one, and goodbye.